Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well today. We're so happy to have so many of you join us today for our webinar, The Basics of UX Benchmarking Research to Measure Product Performance. My name is Lynette. I'm part of the team here at AnswerLab. And before we start, I'd just like to mention a few things. Number one, if you'd like to ask any questions, you can do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if we have time, we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the discussion or follow up with a response. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll all receive that recording via email after this event in case you'd like to review some of the information we provide today. We're going to do our best to keep this to 45 minutes so everyone can stay on track for the rest of their day. Now, a little bit about AnswerLab. For those of you that aren't too familiar with AnswerLab, we are a full-service UX research company. We provide user experience research, consulting services, and flexible research engagement models to help companies apply a human-centered design process to every product that they launch. Our mission is to help create experiences that people love. In today's discussion, we'll be chatting with Helen Herbst and Tara Weatherholt, two senior UX researchers here at AnswerLab.
Hi, everyone. I'm Helen. I'm a senior UX researcher here at AnswerLab. I work primarily on benchmarking projects, and so here we are. And on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all excited and 5 is extremely excited, I am a 5.5 to be here.
Hi, I'm Tara Weatherholt. I'm also a senior user experience researcher with AnswerLab, and I also work mainly on benchmarking studies along with Helen and sometimes alongside Helen to help companies improve the user experience of their products.
All right, so here's a quick glimpse at what we're going to be talking about today. Because this is a discussion on the basics of UX benchmarking research, it's going to be kind of a broad overview. So here, if you will, is the broad overview of today's broad overview. We're going to be talking a bit about what UX benchmarking is, how it works, why you want to do it, and drill down a little more focused until finally the Q&A portion at the end of today's webinar. So beginning at the beginning, we're going to talk a little bit about UX benchmarking. What is it? What is it all about? And in its essence, UX benchmarking is the process of evaluating user experience of a product or service by using specific, sometimes custom metrics to gauge relative performance against a meaningful standard. Meaningful standard being anything from your own internal goals to the level of performance of a competitor to perhaps a previous benchmark you've conducted on the same system. And the thing that makes UX benchmarking unique is that it is able to combine these more quantitative custom metrics with that qualitative analysis that we all know from UX to allow us to capture rich, repeatable insights to answer a lot of fundamentally qualitative usability questions. That repeatable piece is especially important because benchmarking really shines when you're able to conduct it on a repeat basis over time, because it is at its core a process of test, change, retest. So whether you're looking to benchmark against your competitors or to create a benchmark or baseline for future iterations of the same experience, benchmarking your UX can set you up for long-term success. And moving forward a little bit more just on UX benchmarking as a concept. The pairing of observational and participant feedback provides data for several analytical approaches, giving you a range of benefits and outcomes. So benchmarking provides both comprehensive big picture frameworks for your overall product health, as well as that detailed usability information that you can only get from a participant-based usability test, and using your own observational data and their feedback directly from the participant. It's this combination that gives you that great insight as well as a holistic, prioritized picture of product health. This is in contrast a bit to purely qualitative usability studies, which do also track participant behaviors and feedback, but don't attempt to set baselines based on specific objective metrics in the same way. Answer Lab's approach to benchmarking specifically involves conducting consistent, high validity usability tests that can become regular measurement tools for product health. But what can UX benchmarking accomplish? A number of things really, and you already probably heard me mention product health, and that's one that I'm probably going to drill into you over the next 45 minutes or so. These are just a handful of things that benchmarking works really well for. Product health being one of them. You can build a competitive analysis. It's great for diagnosing usability issues, then prioritizing improvements to those issues. It can help to inform your overall product roadmap, as well as to establish a proof of concept. And we're going to drill down into each of these individually, starting, of course, with number one, with a bullet, understand overall product health. Benchmarking is a fantastic approach for helping to gather a baseline data set to understand which parts of your product work well and which need improvement. We'll touch a little more on a couple of different approaches for benchmarking, but either of these approaches can give you the full holistic view of the product health, or even a more granular view of individual flows within a product. Moving on to build a competitive analysis. It's that focus on consistent metrics that exists in UX benchmarking that really allows for easy comparison of similar products. So you can see where one product outperforms another and where they compare and contrast. Moving on next, for critical usability issues, this is a basic part of any usability test really, but having those benchmarking metrics within there, as well as getting context from the participant on their own perceptions with regard to those metrics, helps to provide usability information that can really target these major and minor usability issues in your system. Once you've diagnosed those issues, within the success and failure metrics, it's easier to be able to prioritize which things need attention first and foremost, based on the scale and impact of the issue. So it's easier to prioritize improvements after getting that insight from your benchmark. Benchmarking can also provide critical information about which tools in your product are most important to invest time in to improve your user experience overall. And then establishing a proof of concept. So if you have a new product that you're looking to launch, or you're adding an additional feature to an existing product that your users already know, benchmarking can help to validate, or in some cases invalidate, how successful your design will be in the hands of your actual potential users. But don't take my word for it. This is a statement from a stakeholder that Tara and I have both worked with on a couple of rounds of benchmarking for a tech product. And she was happy to provide this sort of testimonial in which she said, UX benchmarking has provided my org with a more nuanced and descriptive means to track our progress towards our annual objectives. Through 2 rounds of benchmarking, Answer Lab has helped my team track how well new feature launches are supporting user needs, or where they're falling flat. Answer Lab's insights have helped my team understand where and how we should most effectively prioritize our resources to ensure we're best supporting our users across our product. Now, this was great feedback to hear, but it was especially great knowing how much she appreciated the insight from the benchmark metrics specifically. I know this particular stakeholder was really anxious to start a second round almost as soon as we'd finished the first one, because they were really so delighted by the information they were able to glean. So now we're going to talk about these 2 approaches to benchmarking that I mentioned earlier. And again, repeating on the idea of repetition, again, benchmarking is most valuable when you're able to repeat it, as this allows you to maximize the value of data comparisons over time, as well as to compare the impact of changes in your interface. And both of these approaches, comprehensive benchmarking and progressive benchmarking, are easily repeatable approaches that may be taken. And you can pick one depending on what you hope to accomplish with your benchmarking program, as well as the means and time you have available in which to conduct your benchmark study. So looking first at comprehensive benchmarking, this is probably the one I have done the most here at AnswerLab, and it's one you may have already heard of before, as it tends to be the most common benchmarking approach in UX research. Essentially, comprehensive benchmarking is a complete or comprehensive, if you will, assessment of the usability and testing all aspects of a product at periodic intervals. So that could be quarterly, biannually, annually. So really, this form of benchmarking tests everything your product is meant to do in order to gauge overall product health and identify high and low performing areas. When should you use comprehensive benchmarking? Well, it's best suited for when your need is for a complete or comprehensive data set at one point in time. But it may also be the best choice if your product's components are dependent on one another, and testing those components individually would isolate them in a way that isn't realistic to the actual live user experience. So comprehensive benchmarking maximizes time over investment, as you can gather a full set of benchmarking data on your entire system at one time. That said, of course, and I'm going to harp on the repetition again, it's that periodic benchmarking, that repetition of it, that can help you to really gauge your impact or on changes over time. So for comprehensive benchmarking, we typically recommend sample sizes no smaller than n equals 20 per segment. This helps to maintain accuracy when you're cutting your data. And it's also good to remember that for a benchmark of this type, most of them will take about 6 to 8 weeks to complete from kickoff to completion. So not necessarily a short-term study, but definitely one that can provide a wide breadth of great information. Moving now instead to progressive benchmarking. As opposed to comprehensive, progressive benchmarking is an approach that is more paced, in which individual components of a system are tested at a regular pace, such as biweekly, in order to continually assess parts of the system, building into a complete body of data about your product. It's a more bite-sized approach with the intention of allowing teams to focus on the health and usability of individual flows. Progressive benchmarking is best used when you are iterating or releasing components of a product or product suite independently of one another, and you want to test those components or flows individually. It can also be especially useful when you're looking to integrate benchmarking into your regular research program to build a body of data to guide your product roadmap over time, but you don't necessarily have the time or the means to do a full comprehensive benchmark at one time. Then you can get this information about your product piecemeal by flow as you continue on a rolling basis. So for progressive benchmarking, we recommend a smaller sample size, so N of 10 to 12. And that can be used because it's a slightly more qualitative usability focus, though the scope can be increased or decreased really depending on where your focus is. If you want more robust quantitative data, we would recommend a larger sample size again. Or if that's not as important, you can size it down a little bit. So, and I did want to note that it's great for providing opportunities to hyper-focus on individual parts of a system. And most benchmarks in this style take 3 to 4 weeks to complete, and rounds can be completed on a rolling basis. And from there, I am going to hand it off to Tara to talk a little bit more about the methodology of benchmarking.
Thank you, Helen. So now you know the reasons why you would want to conduct a benchmark study, as well as a little bit about the different approaches to benchmarking. I'm going to now talk about the basic steps of implementing a benchmarking methodology. I do want to know that I'm only covering basic steps and knowledge, and that implementing a benchmarking study is more involved than just what I'm presenting here. To kind of bridge the gap between these questions that you might be able to answer through benchmarking methodology and the types of data that you're collecting. This slide shows that in benchmarking, we pair these metrics with qualitative usability insights that allow clients to see how well their product performs and what can help it perform better. So how well does my product perform in the hands of users? That can be answered through collecting success and failure rates on tasks that are designed to test your user journeys. Benchmarking can also help you to understand what hurdles exist for users and the usability of the product by highlighting the barriers or blockers that participants faced in completing the benchmarking tasks. Participant feedback metrics, such as ease of use, also allow for easier probing of what these barriers and blockers are. Benchmarking allows for discrete testing of user flows and functions of a product so that you can determine what areas of your product are most affected by usability issues. The standardized testing of different tasks by multiple participants also allows you to discover whether an issue was experienced more commonly by participants or infrequently. And then, of course, you can develop recommendations based off of your findings that translate into the improvements that can be made to improve the usability of your project. Okay, so the steps for implementing a benchmarking study. The first step of implementing a benchmarking study is to develop tasks that measure your user journeys or user flows that are related to your product. To do this, you'll first want to define the user flows that you want to measure, and then create tasks that will set up the participant to carry out that user flow. For example, perhaps your product requires a sign-up process and you want to understand if there are usability issues for that sign-up flow, or perhaps your product involves setting up a profile. These are specific user journeys that can be turned into tasks, discrete tasks for participants to complete. In developing these tasks, you may want to observe a natural flow, which would be multiple tasks together, or you may want to isolate specific individual user journeys. When isolating these individual journeys and creating discrete tasks, it's important to make sure that you're measuring what you intend to measure. In addition, you may have several tasks for one particular user journey. The next step of implementing a benchmarking study is to gather your data. Participants will be presented with these tasks that you've developed, and you'll observe and measure their success in completing the task, as well as asking for feedback on the metrics that you have developed. So here are the common benchmarking metrics that are utilized in typical benchmarking studies. Some are observed and some are reported by the participant. During task development, you'll have already predetermined your definition of task success and task failure so that when participants are completing the task, you'll be able to clearly determine whether that participant had success or failure in completion. You may want to measure the time it took for participants to complete the task. However, I do want to note here that users can vary greatly depending on technology expertise, accessibility issues, and other factors. So time on task is not always a useful metric for usability. Seeing that we may have some issues with the screen share. If anyone can comment whether it is.
I think we're good to go, Tara.
Good to go. Okay.
It's looking okay now.
Great. Okay. Before the participant begins the task, you may want to know how familiar the participant is with the type of task that you've asked them to do. For example, if your task is asking participants to upload a file to their computer, knowing whether a participant is very familiar or not familiar at all with doing that type of task generally, that can help frame their success or failure at completing it. After the participant completes the task, some common metrics to collect are their level of satisfaction with completing the task, as well as how easy or difficult they found the task to complete. At AnswerLab, we don't necessarily prescribe one set of ratings for every study, but rather we work with specific project teams to understand what metrics are most valuable to capture. Once the participant has completed the task, then is the time for probing about their experience. So capturing the path the participant takes to complete a task can help you identify the common approaches to the task, as well as creative workarounds and unexpected journeys. Areas in which participants seem to struggle completing the task will also provide useful information about which aspects of your product may present barriers to using your product. Step 3, of course, is analyzing the data. So when analyzing your data, you'll be able to see from the average success and failure rates which user journeys need attention and which may not need attention. The feedback from participants will enable you to hone in on what exactly those issues are that need addressing and why. So this relates back to what Helen said about getting both the big picture and then more detailed findings about usability issues related to your product. Altogether, you'll have this data that supports your plan of action to meet the needs of users and improve the user experience. Now I'd just like to talk a little bit about some best practices in benchmarking. So as I mentioned before, this is not a comprehensive view of all that it takes to carry out a successful benchmarking study, but here I have put together a few key best practices when designing and implementing benchmarking. First of all, ensure in your task development that you are indeed measuring what you intend to measure, and that you have developed clear task, success, and failure criteria. Benchmarking is also very structured. Moderators go by a very scripted, detailed script so that each participant receives the same stimuli. We want to ensure that any differences are actually from the participants' experience using your product and not from the different wording choices or information that they receive from the moderator. It's also best that participants complete the tasks silently and that feedback and probing are done after so that participants are focused on completing the task and not on sharing their experience. When asking participants to provide post-task ratings about their experience completing the task, it's best to get their rating on each metric consecutively and then probe about them because it allows for clean measures of their ratings. Probing before getting each metric rating may influence participant memory of their experience. And then finally, in benchmarking, you can incorporate groups of participants to better understand differences in user types. Okay, and now back to Helen.
All right, so let's talk some takeaways. This was our, as mentioned, sort of broad overview of UX benchmarking. So to go back sort of over those basics in summary, if you will, and you can move on to the next slide. Again, what is UX benchmarking? Essentially, it is the process of evaluating the experience of a product or service against a specific standard, such as a goal, a previous benchmark, or competitor performance. Why do you want to benchmark? Well, mostly it is to understand overall product health, often with the aim of correcting critical issues, competing more effectively, and improving over time. And then how do you benchmark? And this is more on the methodology piece, but ideally it's by conducting consistent usability tests, either comprehensively or progressively, and ideally repeated at regular intervals, and including metrics such as success rate and those user perception ratings that Tara mentioned, such as familiarity and satisfaction. And that's the big deal with benchmarking. I know we've gotten a couple of good questions while we're going through this.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Helen. Yeah, we did get a few questions submitted by our participants today, so we'll jump right in. The first question we have here: what are the pros and cons of unmoderated versus moderated benchmarking sessions?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say ultimately it depends on the means you have at your disposal to conduct a benchmark. I think an unmoderated benchmarking study is likely to be probably less expensive and easier to recruit participants for, because you don't have to have specific scheduling. It's the sort of thing that participants should be able to do more in their free time versus having to get an exact schedule that goes along with a perceived timeline. I do think also in unmoderated testing, there is a possibility, depending on the participant, of course, that the participant is more likely to behave in a more natural or naturalistic way while they're going through the tasks, because they don't have someone looking directly at them and may not have that sense of being watched. And so you may be more likely to get slightly more accurate things like time on task, or a more organic experience of the task that's been put at hand, because they don't feel as though they're being observed. I would say a drawback to unmoderated testing, and this probably goes for kind of all usability testing, not just benchmarking, but you don't have that same flexibility to probe on specific things that your participant mentions, because you're not there when they're making those mentions. So I think one of the best things about having those one-on-one, having the one-on-one ability to have a moderated test is to be able to empathize directly with the participant, respond to what they're saying, and based on what they're saying, proceed with additional questions that could provide additional insight that you may not be getting if you aren't moderating that test.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. Another question we have here: can you do benchmarking with kids?
Sure. I'll take that one. You can absolutely conduct benchmarking research with children if your product is geared for that age group. Just like other research, the standard guidelines for conducting research with children will apply. Some of those things may include gaining parent or caregiver consent, as well as having an adult present while the minor participates in the session. But you can absolutely conduct benchmarking with children.
Great, good to know. Another question we have: what if competitors don't have exactly the same type of product and the tasks can't be directly compared?
Oh, that's good. And that's one I've run into in doing real life benchmarks here, where I've had studies where we're comparing 3 different competitors, and in some instances, the products have some overlap, but by and large, they're different products that don't have identical features and parts. In those instances, you do your best to compare the things that are similar, so you can have tasks that apply to both or all competitors you're assessing. But it also is very valuable to assess those things that aren't similar to, so that you can have a specific task for one of the products that isn't being asked of the other product, and vice versa. So you're able to get insight about the usability of, for example, that feature your competitor has that you don't have. So it depends a bit on the competitor, but ultimately you're still able to compare competitors with a benchmark, but you have to sort of highlight the things that are similar and take benefit from the things that are different.
Great, thank you. We have a few more submitted questions here. So this question is particularly for Helen when discussing the comprehensive benchmarking. So this person is curious to hear more on your rationale for no smaller than 20 per segment when it comes to comprehensive benchmarking particularly.
Yeah, that's kind of a basic sort of research notion, wherein the larger the sample size you have, the more statistically accurate the data you'll be able to get from it is. And because benchmarking does have a more quantitative component than traditional UX research and usability testing, you want to have as accurate a pile of data as you can get within reason. So obviously you're still interviewing people directly, so it's not necessarily going to make sense to attempt to speak to a few hundred people for your benchmark, but you are still trying to get straight numbers about success and fail rates among potential users of the product. So you want to, as many people as you have the time to and the means to talk to, you really want to talk to and run through the benchmarking tasks, because the more information you have and the more consistent and accurate the insights are going to be.
Wonderful. Another question here. This one is for Tara in regards to the best practices. This person would like a further explanation on what you mean by incorporating groups of participants to better understand different user types.
Yes. So what I mean by incorporating groups of participants is that benchmarking allows for you to be able to look at different groups of people or of participants or user types doing the same task, but then you're able to compare the results of those users. So for example, you may want to look at the difference between participants who are regular users of your piece of technology or your product versus new users. And so when you incorporate different groups of participants, you can then understand how different groups behave using your product.
Great, wonderful. Just going through a few more questions here. Okay, another question we have. Under what circumstances would you use Think Out Loud protocol?
Okay, I can take this one. For Thinking Out Loud protocol, she's referring to in a typical usability study, when a person is reviewing a website or using a product, sometimes they are told to think out loud while they're using it, so that you can get the insights on their decision making and what they think about what they're using. However, in benchmarking, unless there's a really good reason to utilize Think Out Loud protocol, benchmarking typically maintains for a participant to complete a task silently and then talk about the experience afterward. And this is typically done because thinking out loud can, if you're collecting time on task, it can influence the amount of time that a participant is using to complete a task. So it can increase that amount of time. Also, it may influence really their decision making as well, because a lot of times participants, when they're thinking out loud, they're thinking out loud, but they're also thinking about what they want to say during a session. So it can influence their performance on a given task within benchmarking. Helen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I have nothing to add.
Okay.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you both very much for this amazing presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, a big thank you to our panelists. As mentioned, everyone will receive a link to this webinar recording and information on upcoming webinars in an upcoming email. And if you found this discussion useful or informative, you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and also check out our website for our Insights blog for more great content. So once again, thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.